all, let's go ahead and just take a quick look. And I've got a video on YouTube about the Second Industrial Revolution, where comparing the First and Second Industrial Revolution. So as far as that goes, remember that the First Industrial Revolution, 1760 to 1830, the methods of production, you're going from hand production to machine production, hand power to machine power. That before 1760, I often mention the parables of Jesus. Jesus and John the Baptist use a lot of agricultural parables. And before the mid 18th century, those still made sense to people. People still understood what a threshing floor was and that sort of thing. People did most things with their hands, which we really don't do today. Now, the mass production of textiles was really the driving force of the First Industrial Revolution. Your power sources being water, coal, and steam. And the engine, the new engine being the steam engine. Now, what we want to remember is that steam power continued to be used in the Second Industrial Revolution, but steam power is, that's the engine that's driving the First Industrial Revolution. And the inventions here, the spinning jenny, the water frame, the spinning mule, the cotton gin. Now, these things, when you look at the spinning jenny and the cotton gin, when we think of an engine, okay, the spinning jenny, the cotton gin, the cotton engine. So the spinning engine. Now, this is, you turn it with your hand, you crank it, and it powers this with this rotary power. And so as far as that goes, these inventions are used with a good bit of power. Now, the water frame, of course, is water powered, but it's still just kind of one step away from hand powered. It's not fully automated. Now, the standard of living for the working class, pretty awful at this time. Think of Alexis de Tocqueville's trip to Manchester, in which he describes the place. It's nasty. So it's important that we understand that this First Industrial Revolution is distinct from the Second, okay? So when we go to the Second Industrial Revolution, let's take about a 20-year break. So now 1850. Now think just before the Crimean War, the American Civil War, and we're going to increased automation. The mass production here is steel, okay? So everything about the Second Industrial Revolution, that's where we start to see. Now, there were railroads in the 1830s, but they were rare because steel was very hard to produce. Now, you've got steel going all the way back to the Middle Ages, perhaps even the ancient world. I'm not really a world history person, but certainly back to the time of the Crusades, where you've got steel swords and stuff like that, you can have steel, but mass producing it, where you'd have to lay railroad tracks, thousands of miles of railroad tracks. That is something that is coming of age in the Second Industrial Revolution. If you look at railroad track miles in 1830 versus railroad track miles in 1890, big difference. Now, the power sources, new power sources, petroleum and electricity, and the internal combustion engine. Now, the thing is, the Second Industrial Revolution, these are things that we still use, that everything that I've got down here is powered with electricity. I'm here with you with electrical power. My car has an internal combustion engine. It uses petroleum. So we're still, this is getting us much closer here. Now, note that the Second Industrial Revolution goes through 1914. World War I is the war that's really the capstone of the Second Industrial Revolution. And you can see here, World War I, you think automobiles, chemicals. We think about chemical warfare during World War I. These chemicals were being experimented with during the Second Industrial Revolution. Railroads, and as I've noted here, prevalent, that before the Second Industrial Revolution, railroads existed, but they were not a prevalent form of transportation, and especially freight transportation. And then so we see here the telegraph, the telephone, the radio, and also not good conditions for the working class, but improving. We see that public health reformers like Chadwick in Britain, we see clean drinking water, sewer, sanitation, stuff like that, and the expansion of the European middle class, okay? And that would also apply to North America and Australia and other places as well, and of course Japan also. So as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, that's what we're seeing here as far as the second industrial revolution. So very important that we know when these things are happening and all of that good stuff. All right. So as far as this goes, let's go ahead now and take a look at what's going on. How do we relate this to imperialism? Okay, so when we're thinking about the new imperialism, which we call it this to distinguish it from the old imperialism, that European imperialism is not new. The British Empire, this has been around a long time, but this is a new wave of imperialism. And so when we look at what's going on here, what really caused this to happen, where Europeans and people of European descent exercised a control over the world that they have not had before or since. So as far as that goes, the first industrial revolution, there's a spinning jenny. Now, when we look at the second industrial revolution, that's when we're getting into some really, really heavy machinery. And part of this is what some refer to as the conquest of distance. All right. So this is something, if you're, I'm a U.S. history teacher as well. So when I think about the Oregon Trail in the 1840s, then you see in the 1840s that people are making these treks across the North American continent over thousands of miles in wagons. And then you see that only decades later, okay, so that's what we're looking at, why you've got kind of that break between the first and the second industrial revolution, that, in the 1860s, you start to see transcontinental railroads, not only in North America, but across Europe, and even the Trans-Siberian Railroad in Russia. So the transcontinental railroads now, to get from Omaha to San Francisco, it is a matter of days, not months, and you're just sitting in comfort, well, relative comfort. I don't think that the cars were necessarily heated if it was the winter, but certainly relative comfort and very little effort at this time. Then in 1858, we have a transatlantic telegraph line. Now, I'm still not quite sure how that exactly works, but that is still pretty impressive. Now, another thing about this conquest of distance is that you see these canals, okay? So the Suez Canal, built in 1869 by the British, and then the Panama Canal, finished in 1914 by the Americans. Now, this brings us to another feature, like when we're talking about the motivations for the new imperialism. One of these would be to protect investments, okay? So the British invested in building this Suez Canal. They want to make sure that that's protected. And so when the British or anyone else was making investments, they want to make sure, okay, we don't want this to fall into the wrong hands, so we might as well make it in ours. And so as far as that, we see that, now one thing that if you want to read a good book, I read Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days in the fall, and that was really, really cool because you get to see this whole idea of how the second industrial revolution has changed things. Now, I would be curious to know how long it would take somebody to circumnavigate the earth today. I would think it could probably be done in 3 days, maybe even less. So, because the thing is, it would just be a matter of just probably taking 2 flights. You'd probably do it in 2 flights as far as that goes. But at this time, Around the World in 80 Days is based on a bet that the protagonist, Phileas Fogg, makes a bet with his friends at one of these clubs, where these bachelors would have these clubs where they went for their meals and they went and they played cards and all of that kind of stuff. And so he bet his friends that he could make it around the world in 80 days. And they said, this is impossible. So they took him up on the bet. And so this whole book is about how he's going from steamship to railroad to, just all of these different technologies that had previously not been around. And it's just a fascinating book. But the world is getting smaller than ever. To people at this time, it's just like, wow, 80 days, you can make it around the world. If you try hard enough and things work out for you, get lucky enough. Now, Another thing going on here is the European diaspora. And so this is where Europeans are going to North America, to South America. That's one thing that when you look at, for example, the current Pope, he is from Argentina, but he is from an Italian family that went to Argentina around this time. Of course, in U.S. history, we refer to these people as the new immigrants that arrived at the turn of the century. But Europeans at this time are going into North America, South America, Siberia, Australia, South Africa. And so at this time, now, of course, this is a lot different than today, because in 1914, 40% of the world's population was of European descent. Now, today, that is nowhere near the case, okay, that the center of population is in China and in India when you look at South Asia and Southeast Asia. So as far as that goes, one thing that we want to note here when we're thinking about the consequences of the Second Industrial Revolution is that there is a very clear line between developed and developing countries, the developed and the developing world. So when we look even today, okay, that before the Industrial Revolutions, there really wasn't that big of a gap. But when we look today, you see that Europe, North America, the United States and Canada, also Argentina and Chile, Australia, Saudi Arabia, Japan, and South Korea. Now, that's something to remember as well when we're talking about this era of the new imperialism, that Japan sees the writing on the wall, and in the spirit of Peter the Great, they westernize very, very quickly, because they believe that if they don't westernize, then they're going to have a serious problem. But you see here this line between the developed and the developing world. And then, you see, which you hear people talk about so-called third world countries, which I don't hear that terminology as much anymore, but that actually goes to the Cold War, whether somebody was aligned with the United States and NATO, or with the Soviet Union and China, or if they were just non-aligned. But when people talk about a so-called third world country or a developing country, this is a legacy of the Second Industrial Revolution. And what you see here is an unprecedented projection of European power. And this is something that, again, we have not seen before or since, as far as the magnitude of the projection of European power. And so as far as that goes, this is something that, yes, the Second Industrial Revolution, I'm so glad to see that this got a whole lot of upvotes, because the Second Industrial Revolution, without this, then you would not have seen the new imperialism. Europeans would not have been able to exercise that kind of dominance over the world at that time. So that was a good question. Now, one video that I typically will show in my AP Euro class, there's not a lot of time for videos, but I do show a few, maybe like 2 or 3 during the year. And one of them I show is Zulu, which you see this mission station in South Africa that is manned by about a garrison of about 100 British troops, and they are facing off against 5,000 Zulu warriors. Now, even, you go back even 30 or 40 years before that, before the repeating rifles became prevalent. Okay, so you go back before the Second Industrial Revolution, you go back before 1850, and go back to that time where it was just, it shoots one time. You load this thing through the muzzle and it shoots one time. 5,000 Zulu warriors would have overrun that position. Now, even though the Battle of Rorke's Drift, which is in Zulu, that was preceded by the Battle of Isandlwana, and that was, the British that were involved in that. It was a British column that was ambushed by Zulu warriors, and it was wiped out. But the thing is, where you look at that stand that those soldiers made at Rorke's Drift, without Second Industrial Revolution technologies, a lot of ingenuity and a lot of luck, that would not have that would have turned out a lot differently than it was. Okay, so as far as that goes, Emily, you are always here with the good questions. All right. So what are the differences between the old imperialism of the 1400s and 1500s and the new imperialism of the 19th century? Okay, so first of all, we would think about in terms of the old imperialism. Now, we want to think about not only the differences, but the similarities. So the old imperialism was much more focused. I mean, of course, it was earlier, but when you go into, it's focused on the Americas as far as colonization. So when you look at colonization there, that they're colonizing the Americas, and really maybe the British are doing more colonizing than most, but settlement colonies. Now we see here, of course, there's a lot of European diaspora, but when we look at the British Empire, okay, so for example, the old imperialism, if we're thinking about the British Empire at the time of the American Revolution, that the British Empire was settled by people who were British. Whereas if you look at the British Empire around the time of the new imperialism, it's really, there aren't a lot of British people going and settling in India, that it's really more about administering these places. Now, in both cases, they are trying to expand markets, expand trade, and to have these different resources. In both cases, they are spreading the Christian religion. That's another thing that happened at times, that there would be missionaries that would go to some of these places, and in order for the best way to ensure that the missionaries were protected was to claim that area and have a governing mechanism there. So as far as that goes, I think also, of course, the degree of technology. One of the biggest things is that if we think about the old imperialism, I a lot of times will emphasize the geography if I'm thinking about this. Because Africa, when you think about Africa and the old imperialism, that was Europeans had a few bases there to coordinate the slave trade, but otherwise would just sail around it. Really didn't have a whole lot of interest in Africa, whereas Africa is very much a matter of interest when we look at what's going on in the new imperialism. That is very much going into this so-called dark continent that really was largely unexplored. Now, partly because they didn't have the technology to stand up to diseases that people that aren't native to Africa and the Caribbean have a hard time if they don't, if they don't have access to quinine, and they end up getting malaria. So as far as that goes, I would focus, if it were me, focus on some of the similarities, but also noting the differences, and largely in geography, because in both cases they are doing some things. Now, remember as well, one of the things we want to remember about the new imperialism is the so-called civilizing mission, or the white man's burden, as Rudyard Kipling put it in his poem. That in both cases we do see those, as I mentioned, the missionaries, and to try to spread religion. So if I were writing the essay, I would be more likely to to go in there and talk about the similarities that we see there, and of course the difference being by degree, because in both cases we see Europeans come into these places and they are subduing native populations through superior technology, whereas in the second industrial revolution that technology is far more superior than the technology. I mean, you think about the first wave of imperialism, during the age of exploration, going into the Americas, without the lack of Indian, as far as that, the lack of Indian immunity to the diseases. There was a lot of deaths, but there was a lot of death based on that. If that hadn't been the case, then it might have turned out different, without so many of the natives dying from diseases. Just a reminder that these sessions will continue weekly through the end of April, and the live sessions are free, but that is something that Fiveable Plus does give you access to all of the replays. And also, what you see here with the replays, you can see these questions. The reason I click on these questions when I start answering, and when you look at a replay, you can actually go straight to questions that you would like answered. So it's not like you have to sit there and watch the whole replay, that you can say, oh, this looks like a question that I'd like to see answered, and let's see what he has to say about that. So it's a really handy thing, and for what it costs, I think it's a great deal. All right, so yes, there will be the last few minutes we will do a Kahoot game. Okay, so totally up for that. All right. Emily, as far as that goes, I think that when we look at, and by the way, if there are any other teachers joining us, we've got some pretty good turnout right now. So if there are any teachers joining us, Emily teaches AP Euro, and you are free, teachers, to ask questions. By all means, you are also free to, talk in the comments, answer questions, that sort of thing. Certainly doesn't offend me, especially as we go deeper into the 20th century. There are things that are kind of outside of my forte, to tell you the truth. Now, I think the Ottoman Empire could be a good illustrative example. Okay, if there's a teacher that's like, hey, I'm really into the Ottoman Empire, and here's an example for that. Now, that's not really my bag. I don't know a whole lot about the Ottoman Empire. But now what we do need to know, what every student needs to understand, is that during the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire is in a constant state of decline, the so-called sick man of Europe. We see that happening in the Crimean War and all of that. So after a decade of teaching AP Euro, it's still not an area of emphasis or strength for me. But I think if there is a teacher who, who's into that, the other thing, like, I don't really go into Austria very much as far as, Austria-Hungary, as far as the internal workings, aside from making a few references here and there. But there are some teachers who are very, into Austrian history. Like, I tend to focus on France and Prussia and Britain and Russia. But yeah, I think that if you like it, then go for it. If you have some special knowledge, go for it. But other than that, I'm not sure. I've never really been in a situation where I saw an AP Euro exam, as far as, the release part, of course, where I looked at an exam and at the questions and was like, I've really got to teach the Ottoman Empire more. Okay, I've never run into that kind of scenario, in a decade of teaching this course. But good question. But I think it definitely, remember that 60% of the exam is stuff that students generate on their own. And when we're thinking about the LEQs, there's a lot of flexibility for a student. All right. So as far as that goes, what were the most important reasons for the new imperialism? Okay. Now I've got something. I am, still working. There are some things about this slideshow. I've never put a lecture on the new imperialism on my YouTube channel, but I do have something that's not especially pretty. But at the same time, let's go ahead and take a quick look at this. Okay. So let me, this is something again that I'm going to need to make look a little prettier, but a few explanations on a pretty old and outmoded slide. Okay, so let me go ahead and pull that up, and I will go over the reasons for the new imperialism. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and share that. All right, and let's take a look here. All right, so the reasons that have been given for the new imperialism. Now, first of all, as I've noted here, I think the strongest the reason that seems strongest, most credible to me, is the obvious, that there was a technology gap in the late 19th century that's greater than it had been any time before or since. That you're looking at people with railroads and steamships, going to places where people are still fighting with spears. All right, so this is a huge technology gap. National security, as I'd mentioned, to protect investments such as the Suez Canal, also naval bases. Now, this is something that can translate very neatly if you haven't taken AP US history yet. When you get into US imperialism, you'll get into naval bases. Alfred Thayer Mahan, and how he wrote the book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And actually, the part of history that he was examining was the age of absolutism, like Louis XIV and the War of the Spanish Succession and all of that kind of stuff. So he's looking at that period, and he is noting that, naval power, essentially, great nations have great navies. And if you look at the United States today and how we're doing the military, the United States has nearly half of the current complement of aircraft carriers in the world. That there are about 50 aircraft carriers, I believe, that are in service, and the United States has 24 of them. So the United States is still convinced that having a worldwide fleet. Now, that's another thing that when you think about Teddy Roosevelt in 1908 or so, he decided, like, look, I'm going to send this great white fleet across the world because I want the world to see, even though a lot of these ships were pre-dreadnought, obsolete battleships, he wanted people to see that the United States had a global navy that was there. Like, look, the U.S. Navy is around the world. We are everywhere. And so, at that time, of course, the Royal Navy was the envy of the world, but the United States Navy today is the most powerful Navy in the world. And that really started at that time at the turn of the 20th century, when Teddy Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So naval power. Another thing that I've mentioned already, we see missionaries and things like that. So, you're trying to spread Christianity, and these missionaries need to be protected. Natural resources, of course, and expanding markets. Okay, now that's something that actually comes out. Like, I saw an LEQ about that actually back in the days when they used to be FRQs. I think I actually scored that one that year. It was really a doozy. It was one of those really like boring ones, because you're basically, it's just, all right, expansion of markets. But the thing is that, think about this. And Emily, when we were talking about earlier, that I would stress a lot of the similarities. If we think about mercantilism, for example, okay, with the age of exploration and the first wave of imperialism, we've got a similar thing going on here, because what's happening with the second industrial revolution is all of these industrial products are being created, and they want to sell these products in these places where they're taking over, and then they want to take in exotic goods. Okay, so to sell industrial products, but also to take in exotic goods. And this was something where, if any of y'all watch Seinfeld, Mr. Peterman, okay, Elaine's boss on a few seasons of Seinfeld, he's really kind of an archetype for this new imperialism sort of mindset. I went over here and I found this and I want to sell it. And, it's just like you have something that looks exotic, like this dress was inspired by dresses that people wear in India and Africa, and that sort of thing. So we see how this is influencing fashion. So, definitely economic matters such as, gaining natural resources and expanding markets. And of course, with natural resources, we want to be aware of the, really, just an awful example of the Belgian Congo and what's going on over there with King Leopold, cutting people's hands off if they're not producing their rubber quota and that sort of thing. Now, then again, when we look at imperialism, it's important to, this isn't some kind of axis of evil. Some of these people, Sir Cecil Rhodes, part of the thrill, I think, was just the thrill of adventure and being out there in the unknown. I've been watching Star Trek Discovery, and that's all. Anytime you're watching Star Trek, it's about going out and exploring something and seeing something new that people had previously not known. And then, so as far as that, the civilizing mission, which I wouldn't totally discount here. This is something kind of like when we think about the first wave of imperialism. You had people like Bartolome de las Casas, people who had really like good motives for doing what they did. And so there were people, who wanted to to civilize. They were going there to try to help. Now, of course, by 21st century standards, that may not seem like something that someone should be proud of, but by the standards of their time, they're trying to help people, and that's where Rudyard Kipling wrote The White Man's Burden. That basically this is a responsibility that that the European world, the Western world has, that we're so far above everybody else that we need to bring them up to that point. Now, would I say the Civilizing Mission was a primary motivation for imperialism? Of course not. Now, that's because my overall philosophy of history, I don't think people do things because they are they are benevolent. I'm really kind of, I've got a lot of sympathies with Enlightenment philosophy, that really it's like, selfishness exists and we need to figure out ways to use that to benefit society, because most people are not naturally benevolent, benevolent, but at least not altruistic. We're not prone to sacrifice ourselves for the good of somebody else that we don't know, that's not part of our family or part of our country or something like that. So as far as that goes, we've got that. Now, going on. Okay, so as far as we got some things about the Berlin Conference. All right, some of this stuff gets there. All right. Okay. Interesting. Okay. We've got some interesting things. You know what? Here's a question that I'm going to take just because I'd like to answer. Okay. Hamza, I just, it's a written test, right? But as far as this goes, was Edmund Burke a conservative or a liberal? Okay, which this is actually, this is a very nuanced answer, because Burke would be best identified as a liberal conservative. Okay, now here's the thing: liberal conservative. Conservative is what he is. Okay, so he is a conservative. Then, as far as that goes, liberal is the modifier. Now, I'm not an English teacher, okay, so I forget whether one of those is an adjective or adverb or noun or whatever, but let's just leave it at that. Okay, that he was a conservative, but he had liberal sensibilities. Okay, that we know Burke best in AP European history for his opposition to the French Revolution. That Edmund Burke felt like, the French, conservatives are very into the preservation of institutions. And as far as institutions go, that, the French, they decided, okay, we're gonna, the British have this constitutional monarchy, we need to do that. And then we need to rein in the powers of the church, and we need to do this and this and this. And Edmund Burke's like, look, the British have a constitutional monarchy because they built this over time, okay? That we've got all of these things from the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights. We've gone through, like, our institutions have evolved. Like when you look at the Glorious Revolution of 1688, that this was a revolution that did not fundamentally change anything. It created no new institutions. It only changed the balance of power between existing institutions, and it was settling what had been uncertain, that in the Tudor years, okay, like, Henry VIII said, we're leaving the church, we're leaving the Catholic Church, we're going to start the Church of England. Parliament passes the Act of Supremacy. Parliament back then was called whenever the monarch wanted, and typically to rubber stamp something. And so during the time of the Stuarts, that time between 1603 and 1688, the whole thing is Parliament, what is the relationship between Parliament and the monarch, and who's going to be on top? And so after that, it comes down to the monarch has to follow Parliament. Parliament has some of its own independent powers, and Parliament will be the sovereign governing body of Britain. And so with that, when Burke was not a fan of the French Revolution because he believed that they were trying to change too much too fast. But the American Revolution, this is what some of you may not know, is that when the United States declared independence, Burke was one of the members of Parliament who said, let them go. Like, there's no reason that these people can't be independent. And why is he saying that? Because he says they have British institutions. They have our, it's like, let them carry our torch into the New World by themselves because they're ready. And so the French, according to him, they weren't ready for constitutional monarchy. You're changing too much too fast. That's conservative, but he also has liberal sympathies, okay? Because when we look at the British tradition, a lot of liberalism comes from that, the whole idea of having, a representative body and having some measure of free speech and some measure of religious tolerance and stuff like that, okay? But that's the thing. So remember that Burke, when you look him up, and you can go to Wikipedia and see this as well, it's just Burke was a liberal conservative, okay? Which I tend to, identify politically as a conservative liberal, which, that has other connotations. So whether someone is a liberal conservative or a conservative liberal, that has, because it's the second word that is the foundation, and then the other word that kind of, that brings that to provide some added clarification. All right. So as far as that goes, that is good stuff. Thank you for that question. All right. So as far as that goes, Henry VIII, yeah, he was a pretty funny guy, wasn't he? All right. So let's go ahead and y'all got some interesting questions here. Let's see what we want to do here. Now, how did imperialism change after 1880? Now, one thing is that, this isn't really a question that I've really addressed in the past, but, now the new imperialism is really, the thing is, I don't think that what we're looking at here, what we're talking about necessarily is how imperialism changed, but how imperialism started, okay? Because this is about the time of the scramble for Africa. Now, let me bring in, because sometimes, and I'm pretty shameless. I'm pretty shameless about, referring to Wikipedia and other things like that, but I think these are good things for you to look at as well, which is part of the reason while I'll refer to them in these sessions. But it's not so much how did Western imperialism change, but this is when it started, okay? So as far as that goes, the scramble for Africa, started around this time. So before 1880, we're not really seeing, this new wave of imperialism. Okay, so as far as that goes, 1881 to 1914, and this, I don't know what we're okay. So that's got 1913, and then areas of Africa controlled by European powers. Which this map doesn't look fun. Well, actually, it's going to be a little bit different because you don't have, you're not going to see Germany there, right? So as far as that goes, we see here that that's going on there. Now the British, okay, as far as that, this is something now. Yeah, it's not really changing. I don't know if it's changing, but that's about when it started. Okay, so we see here that in 1870, only 10% of Africa was under formal European control. By 1914, it had increased to almost 90% of the continent, with Ethiopia and Liberia still being independent. Now, that's important to note here. Ethiopia, because they were a bit more advanced. The Italians had tried to go in there and get that, but didn't quite work out for them. Now, also, Ethiopia was already, it was ruled by a Christian dynasty. Liberia, of course, because of ties to the United States. And so as far as that goes, let me put this to you as well, okay? Because your question focused on a turning point, which we want to note here that, the exam as it is now. Now, when they first redesigned the exam, they had what you call periodization prompts on the LEQ. Now, periodization prompts would focus on a turning point, okay? Periodization would focus on a turning point. But as far as what we see now, we're looking at continuity and change over time, okay? Now, when we look at the new imperialism, I think you're probably most likely for an LEQ to see causation or comparison, which that's what you saw last year on the LEQ prompt, that you saw a comparison. So it was like, what about, imperialism at this time versus imperialism at this time. All right. So as far as that, yeah, okay, excellent. I don't see a name there, but it looks like we might have a teacher in here answering a few questions. I think that's awesome. All right. So just note, yeah, that basically it's kind of starting after after 1880. Now, the Berlin Conference. All right. Now, this is something that when we look at the Berlin Conference, this is kind of curious because at first the Germans are really focused on unification. All right. And this is kind of like the United States in a way as well, that the United States had been focused on expanding west and industrializing and all of that kind of stuff. And so at first, really, Bismarck wasn't all that interested in imperialism, but this kind of becomes that, if you are a great power, if people are going to take you seriously, you've got to have some sort of empire out there. Even Belgium had the Congo. I mean, the Belgian Congo is like bigger than Belgium. So as far as that goes, that this is essentially they're trying to come to the table and they're trying to make this something that is formalized, okay? That it's not, because when you think about it, that you have this continent that 10% of the continent had been claimed by Europeans, and all of these European powers are wanting to go in there. So as far as that goes, it's like, well, let's go and figure out kind of how we want to do this. Now, note here, it says here that it can be seen, okay? It can be seen as the formalization of the scramble for Africa, although some scholars of history warn against an overemphasis of its role in the colonial partitioning of Africa, drawing attention to bilateral agreements concluded before and after the conference. So the thing is, when it comes down to it, there are, several examples of agreements between countries when it comes to this, but the Berlin Conference really stands out as the biggest sort of thing. You might even, compare it in some ways to the Congress of Vienna. It's like, how are we going to do this in an orderly fashion? How are we going to come to the table and agree to do this somewhat in concert to make an agreement? Okay, so the Berlin Conference was basically an attempt to, to get European powers on the, on the same page and cooperating to an extent and reducing, conflict. No, this is mine, and that sort of thing. All right, so we've got that one. Now we've got tons of questions left here. Let's see, I've got another question about the Berlin Conference. We'll just put that one to rest. As far as the problems of the Second Industrial Revolution, I'm not so sure how I would answer that. Okay, my friend Aisha, that I think should focus on, that doesn't get as much airtime, but is a definite tested topic. One thing, Aisha, I don't really, I look at the exam as it's going to be Russian roulette, okay? Because the thing is that, like, one year students will be like, man, the French Revolution wasn't there at all. The next year they'll say, oh, I'm glad I studied the French Revolution. And so I just find that, I've got things that I kind of latch onto, and just, using the Russian roulette example, I just try to chamber as many things just in case. Now, one thing I will tell you is that people that went to my live events, which any of you, just to put that out there, I do live events. I'm going to Huntsville, Alabama next weekend, and doing an A-Push event. And I would love to, if your school either has the budget for it, or if you have enough students, like if you've got over like 60 students at your school that, you could easily raise some money, I would love to come and do a live event on a Saturday between now and the exam. Just a little aside, because I actually have visited, Aisha's classroom. That's how we know each other, because she came to one of my live events in Texas last spring. So just keep that in mind. If you're a teacher, especially, and you're interested in that, get in touch with me through my website. I'd be glad to give you some additional details. So as far as that goes, people that came to my live events, one of the things that I did is I did my boxes, and I compared like the Age of Exploration and the New Imperialism. And of course, I focused on a lot of those similarities, but also threw up a few differences there. And that ended up being something that was on the exam. And I think that when you see an LEQ, you've got a future multiple choice question, a future SAQ. Okay, so a lot of times I like and that's been one challenge of the redesign, is having that paper trail and knowing this is what's coming. So the thing is, the two things that I tend to focus on, because I think they're most beneficial for students just to understand these things, is first of all, the second industrial revolution. I always hit the second industrial revolution hard because there's so much that comes out of that. And so the second industrial revolution as a causal factor. And then I think that having the having the comparisons that they're making, how is this different than what had happened before? Because you're looking at a similar thing. Now, that was just on an exam, so they might take a little break from that, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Now, another thing that I think is another thing that I think is worth noting is social Darwinism. I don't see any questions about social Darwinism, but that's something that a lot of times, to me, just gets oversimplified, okay? That people basically equate, they confound social Darwinism with scientific racism, which, that those are really two different things. That social Darwinism is, in a lot of ways, I mean, it's a philosophy that embraces competition, is really kind of a continuation of classical liberalism, but I think that a lot of people misunderstand social Darwinism. Now, of course, social Darwinism does, focus on competition and focuses on, okay, well, we're clearly, the clearly superior group should exercise dominance. Now, at the same time, though, that there's another side of social Darwinism that I look at in U.S. history. Professor William Graham Sumner from Yale, who was a prominent social Darwinist. This term wasn't really used at the time so much, but he was a prominent person who subscribed to this philosophy that was put out there by Herbert Spencer that focused on competition and really rejected the idea of there being natural rights and natural equality and stuff like that. And Herbert Spencer, William Graham Sumner was very much against imperialism. He was a member of the Anti-Imperialist League, that he believed that, if we value freedom, the other side of social Darwinism is non-interference. And I don't know, a lot, I love Star Trek. Other people don't. That's fine. But General Order 1, or the Prime Directive, okay, which has come up a few times in Discovery, that this basically, that if there's a pre-warp civilization, that they don't engage with it at all because they don't want to interfere with that civilization's natural development. And that is very much in line with social Darwinism, in the sense that, we need to leave that civilization alone, like with the U.S. and the Philippines. It's like we go in there, they're fighting for their independence and against Spain, and then we go in there and, fight against them. And how does that match with American values? So as far as that goes, that philosophy of non-interference and just letting the world go as it is, that's something that I think a lot of people don't pick up on. So that is kind of just a thing that I try to focus on, that, let's actually flesh out social Darwinism a little bit and go beyond the caricature of social Darwinism that a lot of people get. That, again, I think it's equated with scientific racism, which is another thing that was, was around at the time, that I think is really more of a, more of something coming from biological Darwinism than anything else. So those are just a few thoughts on teaching, and I'm certainly thankful when teachers join us. And if you find these things helpful, definitely tell your students about these. All right. So as far as that goes, Emily, you're asking about European migrants during this period. Okay. Now, of course, they came to the United States at that time. They went to the United States. Argentina, took in a lot. So the United States, Argentina, South Africa, Siberia, and Australia would be my top 5. If I were asking that, if I were answering that question, those would be the top 5 that I would put out there. For where European migrants are going. But yes, it is very important to note that basically, Europe is kind of saved by this, okay? Because what's going on is, Europe's got more people than it can feed, more people than it has jobs for, and a lot of places, especially in Southern and Eastern Europe, they're having to deal with, the crisis of industrialization that, of course, the British had already dealt with. And of course, why, there are so many people of British ancestry ancestry like me who live here because their ancestors came over here when there was this crisis of industrialization and things are, not as plentiful as they were in the rural areas and that sort of thing. So yeah, those would be my top 5. All right, so let me just see if there's anything that I could get into that. How did imperialism contribute to World War I? Gilda, that is something we're going to hit World War I later on. Now, I will admit, for me, it seems like the weakest link, okay, as far as outside of Europe, imperialism contributing to World War I. I think it's just kind of like because it sounds good with the main causes. But one thing that I note here, when I talk about in class, and I'm talking about the main causes of World War I look at imperialism as within Europe imperialism. Okay, so I think that really more than like the outside of Europe imperialism, that when you look at something like the Austrian Empire, that had no less than 10 different ethnic groups, that's what I think about when I think about when I think about imperialism that's causing World War I. I'm thinking more in terms of inside of Europe, because you look at the Black Hand and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that was a direct result of having this multi-ethnic empire within Europe. So remember that imperialism does not necessarily have to be outside of Europe. It can also be inside of Europe. The whole idea of one group of people exercising political power over another. Yeah, so as far as that, late to imperialism, major rise. Yeah, and another thing that we want to remember is that what we want to remember about Germany is that by the time World War I comes around, Germany is the largest industrial power in Europe. The United States is the largest industrial power in the world by that time. So by the time World War I starts, Britain has slipped to third as far as industrial power. So we do want to note, yeah, in addition to German unification, we are dealing with a, just all kinds of stuff going on with Germany. All right. So as far as that goes, we are getting toward the let's see about cultural acceptance as a transition. Okay. Yeah. You know what? I will just very quickly, Isabella. Because this is something that for me is just a topic that I find fascinating. And remember that Richard Hofstadter, who's a historian that I very much like to read, but like any historian, he's got a horse in the race. Okay. Richard Hofstadter was not someone who was a fan of, market capitalism. All right. So, now I don't think Hofstadter was now when, he went to a few Communist Party meetings, I wouldn't call the guy a communist. And I think as he got older, he got more, mainstream. But when he was younger, he wrote this book, Social Darwinism in American Life. I think I may have it on my shelf somewhere. But the thing is, it's important to note here that the person who wrote this book, the first book-length treatment of social Darwinism, was somebody who was not sympathetic to the whole ideology of market, market economics, and that's something that led him. Now, of course, when you read the book closely, he is very careful to explain these different variants of social Darwinism. But whereas there's the one that you've got William Graham Sumner, the positivist, and then you've got people who are more jingoistic and racist. Now, here's the thing. So when we think about positivism, I have some videos on a two-part video on Auguste Comte. Okay, Auguste Comte, who was a French positivist, okay? Basically the father of positivism. Now, positivism is essentially it's like when we think about the Enlightenment is about empiricism, but also about rationalism and logic, okay? So we're looking at empiricism, what you see, but also rationalism and logic. Positivism is basically we're going with what we see. That's it. And so Darwinism, biological Darwinism, is a direct outgrowth of positivism, because Darwin goes to the Galapagos Islands and he sees all of these different finches. And it's like, okay, there's this one here, this one here. And so when it comes down to it, he sees all of these different things and he's like, okay, well, the only way that this could have happened is if there was some sort of some sort of evolution of this that was driven by advantageous traits. And Darwin actually I believe borrowed the term, if I'm not mistaken, Darwin borrowed the term survival of the fittest from Herbert Spencer. A lot of times there's a misunderstanding of social Darwinism as an outgrowth of biological Darwinism, but Herbert Spencer's philosophy, he wasn't calling it social Darwinism at that time. That these are like, basically it's a sociology and a biology that are really coming from the same positivist outlook. And this is going to now, this will ruffle feathers, of course, anytime this sort of thing is mentioned. But think about this, like when Thomas Jefferson, wrote that all men are created equal. And it's like, okay, well, that is beautiful and certainly something that we want to strive for. Legal equality is something we strive for in civilized society, and we found that advantageous. But here's the thing, that when you go into nature, is there any scenario where there is equality? So the whole idea of this, when we look at it from a positivist perspective, like especially, think about like a wolf pack or something like that, that, there is an order, there is the alpha, there is, so when you look at, primitive human societies, you look at, animal societies and everything, that it's just, some animals thrive while others in species, any species, plants as well, some thrive and others go extinct. And so when you look at, whether it's social Darwinism or biological Darwinism, this is an outgrowth of this idea that we encounter the world as it is and we just accept it. We come up with a philosophy that is only about that, and it's not trying to go into any kind of like, okay, this is what should be. It's like you imagine the Enlightenment was something that was a lot more pragmatic than philosophies before it. This is even going beyond that, okay, that we go with what we see. And that's why, social Darwinism, looking at nature and seeing those inequalities and seeing how some species thrive and others don't and others go extinct, well, this is how things go when it comes to human relations as well. And so when we see these people who are, very, astute business people and stuff like this, we need to let them do what they're doing because they're just that good, and that these people are, are an advantage to society. Now, of course, then you've got other schools of sociology in the 20th century that start focusing on cooperation within a species, which of course is something, that we could, that you can make that argument as well. And that's where you start to see the advent of progressivism. So as far as that, I think, great question. But yeah, if you want to get me talking about late 19th century positivism and social Darwinism, I always get interested in that. Okay, so as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, it is 10 o'clock. Now, we've had quite a group, much appreciation if you're a teacher who got my email that I sent out earlier, and if you, showed up and or told your students about it, thank you so much for that. And let me go ahead and get this Kahoot game started. Let's see. So I'm going to go ahead and begin a Kahoot game. Let's see what we're going to do here. Okay, so we are going to play. Let's see. I need to go into here and let's see. So game options. Okay, let's see. Okay, random. Okay, we want to do that. Let's see. Off. Let's see. Okay, so I think that we've got what we need, and let me go into the classic Kahoot, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so let's go ahead, and the code is 889931 if you've got the Kahoot app. Okay, 88. Let me see. I'm going to go ahead and paste that into here. All right, so if you want to join us for the Kahoot game, here we go. Okay, so we've got 889931, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll go ahead and get this started. So 889931. Okay, so this is going to be a nice little review for us. We shouldn't have as much lag because it's not like we've got hundreds of people trying to play, but we'll check it out. All right, so we've got 11 players so far. All right, good to see y'all. All right. All right, going to close this out in just a bit. Going to close it out in just a bit. Gosh, Tom Ritchie's son. Okay, I don't have a son that I know of. Y'all are scaring me a little bit here. All right. All right. Okay, we got 20 players. We're going to go ahead and get started, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so 12 questions. Are you ready? Well, you better be. All right, so let's see. Which of these European countries was not colonized by a European nation? All right, nice job, Japan. Okay, which Japan saw what was going on in China, westernized really quick. All right, Mr. Good is on top with 870 points. Which theory is aligned to the white man's burden? Okay, which theory is aligned to the white man's burden? I didn't write these questions. I'm going to give you a disclaimer here. I did not write these questions. I don't know if this is going to, I may have a problem with this. I don't know if I like where this is going. Okay. Thing is, not a fan. Okay. Now that's wrong. Okay. I am not a fan of that. I know the thing is, social Darwinism does not have some kind of social obligation to help. I did not write the questions. Okay. So let's just note that I'm not a fan of this question. So going on with that, yeah, because that's really the whole white man's burden thing is like, we need to help people, okay, that we've got an obligation to civilize people. Social Darwinism does not really come from that we have to do something intentionally, but when people are doing these things, it'll happen on its own. So not a fan of that question. Okay, so as far as that goes, just note that I didn't write this. Okay, but most of these I think will be pretty good, pretty fun. All right. What was the purpose of the Berlin Conference? All right, good deal. Most of y'all got that. Excellent, excellent. Okay, so moving on. All right, Tejas, I tell you, you're getting it. By 1900, nearly 100% of Africa had been colonized by Europe. What percentage before 1880? All right, we actually mentioned that. I'm glad I pulled up that Wikipedia article, huh? And I tell you, don't ever let somebody slam Wikipedia, people. All right, 10%. Very good, very good. Looks like y'all got that. And Tejas still on top there. All right. Leopold II ruled an African empire in this modern state with Hitler-level cruelty. Oh, my goodness. All right. All right, the Belgian Congo. And remember that if you're looking on your exam, you're looking for, really the most atrocious example of imperialism. That's where you're going to go. Okay, Gilda on top here. We're almost at the halfway point. Okay, Heart of Darkness was the Joseph Conrad novel. All right, Teresa. Okay, we got a new face at the top there. What was the most immediate cause of the Berlin Conference in 1825? Now, this would be an elimination thing, okay? So this will be an elimination kind of thing here. I've got two that I could eliminate very easily. All right, so yes, Belgium expansion in the Congo. That's what I didn't realize what that was beforehand. But remember, one thing we want to remember on multiple choice is we can eliminate things very easily. So the Boxer Rebellion was in China. And the Franco-Prussian War had nothing to do with imperialism. It was actually before the 1880s, okay? Now, the other thing, so first of all, you've got two that are off the continent of Africa. Then the British occupation of Egypt sounds to me like something that was a little bit before that, because the Suez Canal in the 1860s. And so I was going to guess the Belgian expansion into the Congo. But remember that two answers were very, very easily eliminated, which is what you're frequently going to see on the AP exam. You're going to see where two answers can very easily be eliminated. All right, and Teresa's still on top here. All right, Kulturkampf. Now, this is not necessarily right there related to imperialism, but this is good. I like it. We've got an association here. When you hear the word Kulturkampf, what are you going to associate that with? All right. Yes, conflict between the government and Catholics in Germany. That's, of course, if you want more on that, look at my video on Bismarck's Realpolitik, part of my series on German unification. All right, Teresa, nobody's taking her down, and she's starting to open that lead. Tejas, you're, I tell you, got to get on up there. Which event led the British to direct control over India? Now, before this time, it had been controlled by the British East India Company, kind of a joint stock colony before that. So what happened here? Okay, very good. The Indian Rebellion, a rebellion in 1857 that was seen as, the royal administration came in from that and took the charter away from the British East India Company. All right, Teresa, you are nailing it. All right, and Tejas gaining a little ground there, but still a gap. All the following are causes of the new imperialism except. All right, this should be an easy one. If you don't get this one, you're out. You're just out. Just kidding. You can play even if you get this wrong, but you shouldn't get this one wrong. All right, very good, very good. Now, remember the need for raw materials, that was something that was a cause. Now, the expansion of slavery, is the one that's not right because by the 1860s, you see that slavery is gone just about everywhere. Now, the last country to get rid of slavery was Brazil, and that was in 1888. Okay, so it looks like here that Brazil slavery was abolished in 1888. Let's see, so 1888. But before that, I mean, Brazil was kind of a holdout there, and of course, that was where slavery was most common and prevalent. So by that time, But slavery had been phased out just about everywhere else. The British Empire abolished slavery in the 1840s, I believe. Okay, so it was well before this. So, wow, Teresa, okay, is streaking ahead with 5 in a row. All right, we'll see if anybody can take her down. What does the Midlothian campaign refer to? Actually, I'm not quite sure about that one. That's, whew. I don't know. Good luck with this one. All right, that was Gladstone. Okay, some people familiar with British politics. All right, good job. And I figured it was one of these because you see Gladstone and Disraeli there, so that's what I was thinking. All right, so Teresa still ahead with just a few. Oh, just one to go. After the Opium Wars, the Treaty of Nanking. Ace Ventura, Pet Detective. All right, and that is the ball game. And Teresa, TW, and Tejas, very, very good, all getting a majority of the questions right. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that's our session. And I think that Fiveable is going to be incorporating those Kahoot games into our session from now on. We'll see. I don't know if that's going to be an every week thing, but that's something Fiveable had prepared. So I accessed. I didn't have anything to do with construction, but I think that was fun. That was a nice way to end our session. So we will be back next week. And let me now remember, follow Think Fiveable on Twitter and Instagram because you're going to see stuff there. And so next week, I'm going to be looking at Impressionism. Okay, so we're going to be focusing on Impressionism and other art movements. Okay, but remember, as always, we can take questions on other things. And then the following week, World War I. All right. Tejas, is it Tejas? All right, so I'll be working on that. I'll get that right at some point, even though it's a written test, right? Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, thank y'all for joining us. I think this has been our highest attended session yet, so much appreciation, and I'll see y'all next week. It's always a pleasure. Jillian, it is my pleasure.